I knew about the book Communion long before I worked up the courage to read it. I have a vivid childhood memory of a face on the cover of a book in the Walden books of my local mall, a face that was so terrifying and so beautiful that I had to force myself to look at it, even at the risk of being drawn into some other world by those great dark eyes and Mona Lisa smile. But I did look. The author of that book is our next plenary speaker, who I have the honor of introducing today. Whitley Strieber is a Texas-born author whose career began with a series of popular horror novels. His first two novels, The Wolfen in 1978 and The Hunger in 1981, were both bestsellers that were eventually produced as feature films. And although he does not often get credit for it, Strieber was also an early author of what is now the popular genre cli-fi, or science fiction that focuses on ecology and climate change, and best-selling novels like Nature's End with James Konetka and The Coming Global Superstorm with Art Bell, which was eventually produced as a feature film titled The Day After Tomorrow. In 2018, I mentioned this to Strieber before going on to tell him that I thought his entire body of work was really about ecological awareness. Yes, it is, he replied immediately. In 1987, Strieber published Communion, a True Story, a work of nonfiction that described his experiences with entities that he called the Visitors at his cabin in the Catskill Mountains of New York. The book was an immediate bestseller. Communion did a great deal to popularize our contemporary notion of alien abduction, although throughout the book, Strieber never settles on any single interpretation of the precise nature of his experience. Following the publication of Communion, Strieber and his wife, Anne, began to receive what eventually became a flood of correspondence. Hundreds, thousands, and eventually hundreds of thousands of letters poured into their P.O. box, all containing unique versions of the same message. Now I know what happened to me. Anne Strieber committed to reading and indexing every letter, and eventually a short anthology of the contents of this massive correspondence was published as the Communion Letters in 1997. Strieber donated these letters, now organized as the Anne and Whitley Strieber Collection, to the Woodson Research Center at Fondren Library in 2017. Whatever the nature of these experiences behind these letters may be, the volume and depth of this correspondence suggests, at the very least, a startlingly common and largely ignored dimension of human experience. In my own opinion, these letters represent an archive of nothing less than those abundant areas of human experience that our own prevailing cosmologies fail to account for. Please join me in welcoming our next plenary speaker, Whitley Strieber.
Thank you very much. Well, how lovely to be here and also with everyone who is watching on Zoom and will watch on Zoom in the future. First, I must say that the presence of Anne Strieber is very much part of this, following on in a way from Leslie's discussion of Stuart Alexander and his work and her own quest to find a connection to our dead. After my wife died, after Annie passed away in August of 2015, she began to return an hour and a half later by telling friends to call me whenever I felt. I kept asking her, of course, are you still here? Do you still exist? And over the next 2 weeks, this happened so often that even Annie was somewhat skeptical about all of this stuff, but I am, if anything, a truly thick-headed skeptic, had to admit that she was back. That began a relationship that is now a working relationship. We work together. I wear both rings because, in fact, I look upon us as a couple who is down to one body, but still a couple. So, and you can read more about this in the book we wrote together after she passed away, called The Afterlife Revolution. But I will say one thing from that book that I think is very important and that animates and or can energize this whole field in a new way. It is this phrase: the human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions. Now, the piece I'm going to deliver today, and I'm like Jeff, I deliver my pieces formally for the most part, is called in the Archives of the Impossible brochure simply Them. That is the title of the new work that we're doing together, which is an attempt to characterize and create some kind of a sense of personality of this presence that is emerging into human consciousness in so many different ways. One of the things that Annie said while she was working on the letters, she came out of her office one day and said, "Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death." And there is a merger between the close encounter experience, alien contact, and the dead. This is all part of one enormous arc of the impossible and the new. And we, in order to understand any one part of it, we must look at it holistically as a very large and extraordinary human mystery. I would like to thank Jeff Kripal for spearheading the Archives of the Impossible. And I do recall that when he phoned me and asked me for the letters, I thought to myself, my God, that's impossible. I couldn't believe anyone wanted them after Annie and I had kept them very carefully, but they'd been sitting in a storage space for nearly 25 years at that point. No one was in the least interested in this nonsense. I can remember back in the early days when someone came into the house, it was either a writer working on a book or perhaps a reporter who said, while we were working on the letters, he said, "Well, this is all just anecdotal." And Anne said, "Anecdotal? Just a minute." And she came back with one of the big post office boxes filled with letters, poured them over his lap and said, "It's not anecdotal." You could cross Annie at your risk. I know that. I did it often. She once said to me, "You know, you may be the most annoying man in the world." And then my son popped up. He was a teenager and said, "Well, you know, Dad, you really are the most embarrassing father in the world." And I thought, my God, he's right. Poor kid. In any case, I would also like to thank Amanda Folk and her wonderful team at Woodson, who are doing a tremendously good job on this. When I walked in there a few days ago and saw what they had done with those letters, my heart opened with gratitude. It meant so much to me. And Rice University for opening its mind and heart to the impossible, and the volunteers who have made it all of this happen, and in particular Timothy Grieve-Carlson for his kind introduction. My contribution is this archive of letters. And what happened early on was that Anne realized that the narrative emerging from the letters went beyond the apparent abduction that I had experienced. It was in fact uniquely strange and entirely unknown. It wasn't present in the UFO literature at all for the most part. It did not follow the narrative that had been published at all. And these letters, one of the things that makes them so precious is that they're from before the internet, when people had many fewer inputs to draw on. And you can read them one after another. I've read about 200 of them this week. And you see the spontaneity. This is raw human experience as it is really happening. What was happening to people in the privacy of their own lives was exactly what Carl Sagan had once predicted would happen if alien contact took place. It would be stranger than we could possibly imagine. Today I'm going to be reading just one of the letters that illustrates this extraordinary level of strangeness and analyzing it. What I think we're dealing with in these letters is essentially a communication of a kind that we simply do not know in our world, and yet one that will offer us so many directions for studies once it is taken seriously that it could occupy the attention of researchers in many different disciplines for a very long time. At any rate, that's my hope, and it was certainly my wife's hope. This particular analysis is from the work in progress, Them, about the personality of the phenomenon that seems to be behind contact. What I'm going to do is I'm going to analyze the contents of the letter by using our own mythology as a tool. Matching these stories to myth enables us to understand them in the context of what Jeff called in his opening comments the spatio and temporal vastness of the phenomenon. Specifically, I will reconstruct the letter as a journey through the labyrinth of the Minotaur. Our visitors will be our Ariadne. Her thread will be the events described in the letter. We and the family who had this experience will be Theseus. I'm doing this in the context of a myth from my own culture, because it's my culture. But every culture has myths that are relevant in one way or another to this experience, because it is somehow connected to us through our myths and in our myths. Jacques Vallée's marvelous book, Passport to Magonia, which is a profoundly revolutionary text, certainly makes it clear that this is true. This letter was sent to us by a correspondent whom we later met, and who, to an ordinary observer like me, appeared along with her family to be a normal human being whose only deviation from the norm was that she, along with her family, experienced a series of events that cannot happen. Except, of course, they did. Anne called this letter The Visitors in the Trees. Our correspondent wrote as follows. The event I'm going to relate happened at our house in a sparsely populated part of the countryside. The house has 2 stories and is built on a steep hill, so that when you look out the windows on the 2nd floor, you can see into the tops of the trees that grow next to the house. At about 9 p.m., what I thought was a large car with bright headlights rolled down our gravel driveway. I was washing the dinner dishes while looking out the kitchen window, which overlooks the circular driveway. But I didn't see any car there, so I thought nothing of it and went on up to bed. We slept until around 7 a.m., and when I was back at the kitchen sink after breakfast, I looked out the window to see a woman in a red windbreaker jacket enter the stables. She was wearing white pants and was holding a long stick in her hand. I told my daughter to go see who it was, but when she returned, she said no one was there. I then saw a man jump off the pump house nearby, which is 8 feet tall, and run off toward the trees. He was small, with brown hair, and seemed to bounce in a way that had no relation to gravity. Next, I left to do some marketing, and when I returned, my husband walked up to me and said, "There are people in the trees. We've been trying to talk to them, but they won't answer." My husband and I walked up to the front porch where we saw the children calling up at the treetops, "Come down, we won't hurt you." I looked and saw that whoever was up there had constructed some sort of platform. We went upstairs to look out of the bedroom window at the beings who had been trying to talk to from below. The 2nd-story windows are just at the right height so that we could view them on a level plane. The trees they were in are right outside this window, about 16 or 20 feet away, so we could see the beings clearly. I said to my daughter, "Do you see what I see?" She said, "Yes, Mom, there's 2 of them." "What's that thing coming out of that one's head?" I noticed that there was some kind of beautiful beaded antenna sticking out of the left side of the head of one of the beings. The other wears a fantastic jeweled necklace. One of them looked slightly oriental, and the other seemed more American, but smaller, and with a brown mustache. One of them had on a remarkable piece of jewelry. It was a band striped in metals of all different colors: silver, gold, platinum, green, red, purple, and black. We could only see them from the chest up, since the branches and leaves covered the rest of their bodies. I got the feeling they were monitoring everything: our yard, the air, perhaps radio waves. Since they continued to ignore us, we went downstairs and outside again. I felt brave and wanted to find out more about what was going on, so I went out and got our Rottweiler dog. Holding him by the collar, I explored underneath the trees. This caused a commotion, and I saw 10 or 12 pairs of legs, all wearing white pants, scamper away from me up the hill. I let go of the dog, and as I approached the house, I saw a woman who was the same type of being you describe in your books. She was dressed in a Kelly green jumpsuit and was too long and thin to be a human being. She was climbing among the branches of one of the trees next to the house. I said, "You have no right to do that without my permission. You should have asked." I instantly realized how silly this accusation sounded, and I quickly opened the front door and went back into the house. Back upstairs at the bathroom window, this time I was able to get a closer look at her. She was unlike anything I had ever seen. Her arms were long and unbelievably thin, and she had some sort of fawn-colored soft leather flight cap on, of the type that pilots used to wear in the old-fashioned open cockpits of early planes. She was also wearing goggles from the same era, although the lenses were shaped to fit her large slanted eyes. I can't recall that she had a mouth or much of a nose. She had soft-looking gloves on, and her jumpsuit was closed down the front with some sort of metal fasteners. She looked like she was engaged in filming and aimed a black video-type gadget directly at me. I immediately jumped into the shower and jerked the curtain shut as fast as I could, whereupon my husband walked in. I said, "Did you see her?" And he said, "No." So I determined to learn more. I left the bathroom and went out of the house, across the front yard, and into the run-down paddock area of the property. There I saw the most incredible being that I have ever seen. It was almost indescribable. A silver, crystal, moving mass of energy and light, with the exact same striped band of jewelry that I described before on it, perhaps where a neck would be. I stood 3 feet away from it, awestruck. The children and I are a little bit vague about what happened during the rest of the day. We remember that about 4 p.m., 2 of our friends arrived, and I told them to come see the people in the trees. I insisted they come upstairs with me and look out the windows, but we saw nothing. The next morning, as we headed for the beach, we noticed the birds were back in the trees again. There had been none there the previous day. My daughters and their girlfriend and my husband and I all talked about the adventure while at the beach. One of them had seen the man with the mustache, as well as some of the other beings. 2 of my daughters verified their height. The third showed me with her hand how tall they were, about 5 feet. My husband took the stance of denial, postulating that we'd all somehow had similar hallucinations. Since then, he's acknowledged their presence, but is reluctant to discuss it. I got very ill after that visit. The following week, I lost 13 pounds. I needed 2 liters of intravenous fluids the following Friday. On Saturday, I was better, after a week of sore throats, fevers, restless nights, and nauseous days. My littlest one has ground her teeth down, and pulls the covers entirely over her head every night. But we're more calm about it now than we used to be. And there the account ends. Now, this is an analysis, or you could call it, I suppose, a deconstruction of this account. Perhaps a year after we received the letter, I met some members of this family. They still appeared to me to be under a degree of stress. So let's now work through the letter. It describes a series of 8 events that move by careful gradations from the ordinary to the completely extraordinary. As I am neither a scientist nor a doctor, I will make only brief reference to the way science and medicine can engage. As we explore the experience through the medium of myth, I think its deeper nature, the communication behind it, will become clear. As you shall see, the letter contains an enormous message that is relevant to the whole process of contact, that tells us where we have come so far and where we are now, and above all, what we can expect to happen next. The letter has been lying first in our archive and now in the archives of the Impossible for around 30 years. Perhaps now is the time for the story it tells to release its energy to the rest of us, and perhaps that is why I am standing here today. Incidentally, I would suggest that unless you know myth, you will not be able to understand the messages that contact is bringing us, let alone how to respond to this very complex and very strange communication. Ariadne led Theseus out of the Minotaur's labyrinth and landed with him on the Isle of Naxos. There he left her behind and traveled on to Athens. She became the wife of Dionysus, god of joy. Her name means most holy. In our culture, holiness has become abstract. We might remember that it emerges out of old words like whole or intact. There is a sense of completion and foundation, as in the idea of holy the firm. Something that is holy is something that is fully realized. And what I'm describing here is probably the inner aim of contact. The Minotaur's labyrinth is our own world. The Minotaur, all the fear within us and the violence that comes with it, that has left us with such a bloody history that is in fact unfolding, sadly, right now, a few thousand miles from here in the Ukraine. And so, fellow Theseuses, or I call you Thesei, let's see if we can follow the thread out of our labyrinth that begins perhaps with the fear of death. But that's not the issue in this letter. That is another part of this great story to be told elsewhere in this book. The book, of course, that's being written, and I have no idea when it's going to be published. So you might want to ask that question later. I'm answering it in advance. The thread is placed into our hands by an event that is just very slightly unusual. And I'm going to refer to the Theseus family as Mrs. Theseus, Mr. Theseus, and the Theseus children. As Mrs. Theseus is washing up after dinner, she notices the headlights of a car in the driveway. As the lights go away, she assumes it's someone turning around and doesn't investigate. A first tiny step. In the wider world, this could be seen as something like perhaps the airship mystery of the late 19th century, which was largely assumed to be a hoax and ignored. The second event is more focused than car lights in a driveway. Now, in broad daylight, comes the appearance of a physical entity. The next morning, after breakfast, Mrs. Theseus is again at the kitchen sink when she notices a woman wearing a red windbreaker and white pants enter their stable. The woman carries what she sees as a stick. Our observer understands jackets. She understands pants. She sees another human being. She sees what she thinks is a stick. It may have been nothing but that, but I might note that there are a number of appendages described in the story, each one more enigmatic than the last. I might add parenthetically that this contact is all about step-by-step progressions into deeper and deeper levels of strangeness. She is going to remember both of these events because her brain may still draw on previously verified knowledge to construct a coherent perception out of what her optical anatomy is delivering to it, an ordinary-looking woman entering her barn. It must be remembered that when something is being perceived, the brain spends much more time searching through its memory banks to find previous examples that match the perceptions than it does transforming into accessible imagery what the optic nerve is delivering. The brain depends profoundly on previous experience to understand current input, which is one of the core reasons that contact is so very hard to remember and clearly, let alone face with equanimity. It would appear that the presence which is managing the human contact experience understands this very clearly. And we can think of this understanding of human brain function as the thread in Ariadne's hand. The Theseus family, all of us, are preparing to enter both the mystery of contact and our own darker mystery, the Minotaur's labyrinth itself. When we finally confront that monster, we will find that he has another name. That name is fear. The stranger in the barn needs to be investigated, but as she doesn't appear to be threatening, Mrs. Theseus, who is busy, calls on her daughter to go down and look around. But there's nobody there. Not surprising. Meeting somebody in the barn wasn't our guide's point. What was important was the acquisition of a second witness. As events become stranger and stranger, corroborating witness is going to be essential. And it would appear that our Ariadne understands this very clearly. She can now draw us a little further toward the freedom that lies beyond the labyrinth. Mrs. Theseus now comes to the third turning in the labyrinth, confrontation with something that is truly impossible. She sees a small figure on her pump house, still human but noticeably strange. Moving the strangeness level a bit higher, the little man jumps off the pump house, but it's 8 feet high, and yet he survives an impossible fall, and now goes further by bouncing off as if gravity didn't apply to him as much as it does to other people. Our correspondent is now engaged with the first level of extreme strangeness. She is just beyond the border of normal human experience. Will the Minotaur now roar? As the impossible man demonstrates vulnerability by running off toward a stand of trees, he doesn't incite any fear. Our figurative Ariadne, by causing the first impossible act to be carried out by a non-threatening form, makes sure that Mrs. Theseus won't drop the thread. She watches, but he doesn't reappear. So she decides that the most reasonable thing to do is to continue with her normal activities. She goes to the grocery store. Just as well, Ariadne is also a weaver, and she has some more weaving to do. While Mrs. Theseus is at the store, the fourth turning of the labyrinth is prepared for her. Mr. Theseus and the kids notice what appear to them to be people climbing around in the trees near the house. When she returns, Mr. Theseus reports this to her. He further says that he and the children have been calling to them to come down. A high strangeness event has been rendered unthreatening by the presence of the husband and children. So once again, Mrs. Theseus doesn't drop the thread. That is not to say there's no stress involved. As we shall see, there is great stress involved. It's just that our skillful Ariadne is preventing Mrs. Theseus from engaging with it. The Minotaur still sleeps. True, there are people in the trees, but the entire family has been watching them, as indeed we all watch UFOs nowadays, not in trees, but in the sky. But does this also mean that aliens live in trees? I don't know, and it doesn't matter. What we can conclude is, whoever this is, there is certainly one clear message. As we don't go up in trees, and they do, they live at least to some degree as we do not. And that's the only conclusion you can draw. You can't even say that they are aliens. We don't know what they are. But we do know that there is something going on between this family and these entities, because there's such a vast amount of witness involved in this. A whole family is engaging in this at the same time. With all these witnesses supporting one another, Ariadne can now safely raise the strangeness level a little higher. We move to the fifth turning in the labyrinth. Mrs. Theseus now also looks up into the tree and sees not just people, but what she describes as a platform that has been constructed among the branches. But what is this? It's not a tree house, but it clearly doesn't appear strange enough to be described in any extraordinary way. In fact, its ordinariness grounds the whole experience, even as its presence in the wrong place advances the strangeness. As ordinary as it is, this discovery is so odd that it could have been frightening. It could even conceivably have caused Mrs. Theseus to call the police. The Minotaur's roar, in other words, could have caused her to drop the thread. But that's not what happened. Instead, she made a crucial decision, one that we are all in the process of making right now, not just in this room and not just those of you listening on Zoom, but everyone is involved. A lot of us don't know it, but that number probably changes a little bit every single day. With her daughter beside her, she chooses to follow her curiosity rather than her fear. I did that myself in, I guess, late January of 1986, when I decided I would go out in the forest at night around my cabin. I had understood that these entities that I had encountered were in some way real. They weren't something in my mind. And I thought, I will go out in the woods at night to indicate to them that I am ready for more. I said to Annie, "Would you like to come?" She said, "Of course not." But that wasn't her role. Her role was actually a bigger role. I was the soldier, but she was the general in this thing. As the tree is only, with her daughter beside her, she chooses to follow her curiosity rather than her fear. They thus make the decision to go upstairs, to ascend, and a new world begins to open before them. As the tree is only 15 or 20 feet from the house, they can see what's happening clearly, and what they see is astonishing. Two people, human beings, one wearing a bizarre antenna and the other a magnificent and magnificently strange necklace. This is an absolutely crucial moment in the story, for it prefigures the climactic revelation, a glimpse of what human life will be like when we have at last escaped from the labyrinth of the Minotaur where we have been trapped since the beginning of time. The journey will now continue into perceptions for which the brains of the Theseuses, as will be true of all of us, will have few points of reference to draw on. And this sort of experience is where neurology and psychology will join disciplines such as religious studies, and for that matter, will physics with its exploration of the nature of reality, and philosophy with its inquiry into meaning. We can use our understanding of how our brains process and catalog input to understand more clearly what is happening when we have these experiences. We also can soothe the Minotaur of fear with our own expertise in psychology and heal stress with medicine. And as we shall see, this will soon be necessary for this family, as in time it will be for very many of us. Having made the decision to ascend, Mrs. Theseus moves toward the sixth turning in the labyrinth. She now sees something that is completely outside of her experience, but it isn't there by itself. It instead is attached to the head of one of the people in the tree, but also somebody she's seen before in a normal state. Remember, one of them looked somewhat Asian, and one of them looked what she described as an American. This is not attached to the head of an alien or some kind of strange, unknown figure. It's attached to the head of a human being, just as the necklace is around the neck of a human being. Just as Mrs. Theseus confronts an unknown device in her experience, we are doing that now. Our confrontation began, of course, many years ago in the form of UFO sightings, but it was embedded into the wider culture when the U.S. government admitted that the Tic Tac and Gimbal videos were of unknown origin. Thank you, Leslie, Ralph, and all who have worked on that and helped such lovely, diffident people involved in changing the world. I just love it. It should not be forgotten that the antenna is attached to a human being and the necklace being worn by one. What this means is clear enough. These strange and wonderful things are in some way connected to us. Later, we will see how. So what will come next for us? Perhaps by looking at what came next for the Theseuses, we can get an idea. We have now arrived at the all-important seventh turning in the labyrinth. And that is that not light we see ahead, faint, but there? Could we at last be about to escape the Minotaur who has ruled our lives essentially forever? Not quite, for that isn't the exit. The admission of contact is the beginning of the journey out of the labyrinth of the humanity we live in now. Leaving it all together, walking out into the light of a mankind that knows the truth of what consciousness really is, and thus can leave our ancient fears, such as the fear of death, behind. That's communion. Mrs. Theseus spots an extremely thin woman with huge black eyes wearing a green jumpsuit climbing in another nearby tree. This new being cannot be seen as one of us. So we have moved from unexpected car lights through a woman with a windbreaker to a gravity-defying dwarf to humans with odd appendages climbing around in trees to the appearance of somebody who is not of our race at all. Does it also suggest now that this interpretation of these events is finally, after all these years, being understood, that we are at the point in the wider world of similar contact? We can only wait, work, and continue to prepare ourselves at every level and hope that we don't drop the thread. But make no mistake, contact with beings like this is not the end of our journey. We search the skies looking for alien contact. This is not the goal, though. The entities people see, they're Ariadne to our Theseus, and our destiny is to leave them behind. Mrs. Theseus tells the strange woman that she has no right to be there. When during the communion experience in December of 1985, I found myself engaged with a similar individual, I said, "Also, you have no right." She replied, "We do have a right." And that was the correct answer. If there is to be a human future, then their dedication to it gives them this right. Had they not been so dedicated, the answer would have been silence. Mrs. Theseus now goes upstairs to get a better look at the creature. This is exactly what so many close encounter witnesses end up doing. What I did so many years ago. People tend to be too curious to hide, fortunately, at least some of us, as in fact more and more of us human critters are. You are too. You wouldn't be here. Her reward is to get a detailed sighting of somebody with long arms as narrow as sticks and wearing a light tan leather flight cap and goggles molded to fit her big slanted eyes. She wears gloves and her jumpsuit is closed with metal fasteners. That is to say, she may look very odd indeed, but what is being demonstrated to the observer is that along with differences in appearance, there are similar physical needs, thus the recognizable clothing. She says with her gear that she is a pilot or some sort of flyer. Now an experiment is conducted. The entity turns and points what looks to the witness like some type of video device at her. Her reaction is to jump back from the window. Just as a person unschooled in photography might be uneasy about having their picture taken, our witness senses some sort of capture here. But is her curiosity stronger? Will she drop the thread? Ariadne waits. And she goes for it. She wants more. She is not alone. I have heard 1,000 witnesses say in one breath how badly they were treated, and the next how much they wanted to learn more. In fact, that's me too. And now the beginning of a new octave, the 8th turning in the labyrinth. Mrs. Theseus leaves the protection of the human world by going outside despite the fact that she has seen an alien there. She then sees beyond the body and beyond life as we know it into another shining life which appears in the form of a crystal mass of what looks like silver light, but wearing the same elaborate necklace that one of the 2 people in the tree wore. So is this then the person who wore the necklace, but now appearing in a form truer to its own reality and ours? We must not forget that the necklace was worn by a human being, and the fact that the 2 people wearing the strange objects were from different parts of the world means that this is about all of mankind, an indication of the actual and completely extraordinary journey of total transformation that is on offer here. She walks up to it, stands a few feet away. It gradually floats off. The encounter that started with the car lights has concluded with a crystalline entity that in no way resembles a human being, or for that matter, any sort of creature as we understand that term. Thus, Mrs. Theseus has been taken through 7 levels of contact and been exposed to the entirely different reality, incredibly beautiful, that awaits beyond. The family compares notes. All the children had seen one thing or another. The husband at that point recalls nothing. Please note the difference between what happened to Mr. and Mrs. Theseus. She was handed the thread of ever stranger experiences, one after another. Mr. Theseus had only a few glimpses. She was provided with a carefully designed experiential foundation that would support the retention of ever stranger memories. He was not. Later, while on an outing, the family discusses what they have seen. The children recall observing the strange people. At this point, the husband does too, but theorizes that it was a shared hallucination. We all live with this level of denial, in our own minds and in our culture. I won't argue against it. Those who live in it need to, or that's not where their minds would be. For them, the Minotaur is not asleep. It is roaring threats and warnings from the depths of their labyrinth. Fear generates anger, and it generates stress. Now comes the part where the medical community must play a role. A week later, our correspondent is in such distress that she goes to the hospital. It is found that she is seriously dehydrated, so much so that she's put on intravenous fluids. Ultimately, she loses over 10 pounds. Such a reaction could be due to various types of radiation exposure, but as the family was fine when I met them, at least 2 years after the letter was written, I doubt that this was the cause. Stress also can generate such symptoms. A further indication that it was stress that it was involved is that Mrs. Theseus also reports that her youngest child began to grind her teeth at night. It is going to be up to the medical community to discover what kind of exposure to these new presences we can and cannot tolerate. This is all part of the message, I think. We're not in for an easy time. Admitting the new into our exterior world, let alone our interior universe, is an extremely difficult and stressful task. It cracks the foundation of what we know and threatens to turn the solid footing of our understood world into the shifting sand of the unknown. What we have observed here appears to have been an experiment in contact. Was it that, though? Really that? It seems so, it may be so, and if so, then we can expect sooner or later to see figures that do not appear to us to be human. When we do, though, it will be important to try to forget the human-alien dichotomy. There is intelligence in this universe, and we are all part of it. One humanity, then, many different races, all seeking the same outcomes that we do, but traveling down different paths. Careful analysis not only of the communion letters, but of the whole enormous literature of contact, this huge, improbable story, will enable us to familiarize ourselves with that logic, to make it the basis for a grammar of communion with the mind behind it. The Archives of the Impossible is about just that, looking carefully enough. Not only the letters, but all of this material assembled in one place from so many authors and researchers in this impossible field provides as rich a resource for research and study of this immense, immeasurably complex phenomenon as exists, or has ever existed anywhere on planet Earth, and who knows, any place where the search for inner and outer truth goes on. Looking at the story of Ariadne and Theseus, we can see not only our own future in contact and beyond, but also the motive of our visitors. Ariadne marries Dionysus, that is to say, she embraces joy and becomes holy for it. The only words the visitors ever said to me in clear spoken English have been two: have joy. And for all the darkness and the danger, and despite all the confusion that it brings, ultimately this whole experience is about that holy thing. Our visitors will experience it when we finally leave them behind in this reality, just as Theseus left Ariadne behind on Naxos and set out on our own. They seek for us to leave them behind and take the journey of Theseus to Athens, the city of the philosophers and their legendary stone of truth called gold because it is eternal. The whole vast experience of sightings, disclosures, revelations, discoveries, and contact is Ariadne extending her thread to all of us. Shall we take it? Do we attempt to leave the labyrinth of our history and our lives, that for all of the horrors is also the only home we have ever known or can imagine? She will linger here for a time, but my sense of it is that this does not mean forever. There is no guarantee that we will take the thread. The vast majority of us don't even know it's being offered. Those of us who do are divided in our views. Is this dangerous? Is it valuable? Is it even real? Or are visitors really Sancho Panza to our Don Quixote? There is only one way to find out. Let's take the thread. Thank you.